Good afternoon. My name is Mike Pissarro. I am the Policy Director for the Watershed Institute. Welcome to our second of our Technical Friday series. I have with us Erin Stretz, who's our Assistant Director of Science and Stewardship, to talk to us about the 2018-2020 Integrated Report, Fishable, Swimmable, and Drinkable Waters. Again, this is a series, so the first Friday of each month, we will be having a sort of very detailed, high-level, wonky type of topics for engineers, planners, attorneys, environmental advocates to help expand our knowledge and capacity. All right, Erin. Go to the next slide. As part of our series, we have a land acknowledgement. We recognize that the land and water now under our care is the traditional ancestral territory of the Lenape. We pay respect to the Lenape people, past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in the homeland and throughout the Lenape diaspora. We respect their knowledge, culture, and tradition, which have contributed to the conservation of land and water. Next slide. So just a couple sort of logistics things. We are recording. We will be sending you a copy of this recording as well as the presentation in a follow-up email, and will be available on our website or our YouTube channel. If you do have a question, there is a question and answer feature in Zoom. Please use that, and we will take questions mostly at the end, but I may interrupt with a couple questions, Erin, if that makes sense. Again, thank you for your participation. And Erin, take it away.
Thanks, Mike, and hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to our Technical Friday session at the Watershed Institute. As Mike said, I'm Erin Stretz. I'm the Assistant Director of Science and Stewardship at the Watershed. And today we're going to talk about a document that is full of acronyms and secret codes. And so I figure it's best to start right at the beginning. We are talking about the New Jersey Integrated Water Quality Assessment Report, which we lovingly refer to as the Integrated Report. And I'll start by talking about why this document exists and what we're trying to achieve by it, how it is assembled, including the data that goes into it and the water quality standards that the data is compared to. And then we'll look at what the report says, looking at the 2018-2020 report and comparing that through some reports over the past couple of years back to 2012. So there's an interesting history of stream protection in the US. Back in 1899, one of the first regulations was the Rivers and Streams Act, which was basically an act to try to remove garbage from streams that were blocking ship passage. So the interest there was not to clean up streams in order to protect them for ecological posterity, but just to get the crap out of the river so boats could go through. That increased somewhat, very little, to the Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1948. That act, it was originally written by some very earnest lawmakers and was really beaten down in the process to the point where they withdrew their support of the bill when it was finally passed. But that act pretty much made water quality protection the state's problem. The act only applied to waters that were interstate. So in our state, that would be something like the Delaware River or the Hudson River. But the waters that were wholly within the boundaries of a single state, you know, the federal government was very hands-off and said, hey, that's your problem. But in 1972, the Federal Water Pollution Act was completely revamped and renamed as the Clean Water Act, which we know today. And the Clean Water Act set forward some pretty significant goals for surface water in the US. And those goals are illustrated in this graphic on the right-hand side. The Clean Water Act stipulates that our waters should be swimmable, drinkable, and fishable. And so the clean water, it has a bunch of different sections that outline how exactly we're trying to get to that point. But I'm focusing on 2 of those sections today. Section 305B requires a comprehensive review of water quality within each state every 2 years. And 303D requires a listing of all the impaired waters of the state. So clearly, these 2 sections are very much intertwined with each other. You can't have a listing of all impaired waters without having done a comprehensive review. And you can't have done a comprehensive review without listing impaired waters. So in the early 2000s, these 2 sections, or the deliverables for these 2 sections, was combined into one document, and that is the integrated report. The report is assembled by state environmental agencies. So for us here in New Jersey, that's the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. And they have to submit this report to the EPA every 2 years, ideally. So what do we need to create the integrated report? First, we need an inventory of all of the surface waters within a state. So we need to know what's there in order to assess it. Number 2, we need high quality water monitoring data. So information that we can rely on about the current conditions of the streams so we can assess it. Third, we need a list of what our ideals are. What are the stream conditions that we're looking to achieve? So we've established water quality standards and criteria by which to compare the data that we collect from our streams. And then fourth, it's the assessment. We take the data, we take the standards, and we match them up to see how well our waters are actually meeting these standards. In New Jersey, we have a huge diversity of different water body types. We're coastal, and we're pretty much surrounded on all sides by water. We have about 20,000 miles of streams throughout the state, about, 1,000 square miles of estuary and ocean, and almost 1 million acres of wetland. And so one of the questions that the Clean Water Act posed was, how far down, like what is the scope of the different types of waters that the integrated report is supposed to assess? What is a comprehensive review? Does it include the little pond in your backyard? Well, you may have heard about something called the Waters of the United States, or WOTUS. This rule was significantly weakened during the Trump administration. And there were some proposals that came out at the end of last year that were trying to take it back up to its pre-Trump era. So with this, basically anything that you would call a stream or a lake or a river, estuary, an ocean, a pond is included within the waters of the United States and is included under the scope of the Clean Water Act and of the integrated report. There's some fuzziness, at least for me, in terms of like ditches, agricultural ditches, especially those that aren't connected to what they call navigable waterways. But something that is interesting is that the wetlands, our 1 million acres of wetlands, are included under the scope because they're so intrinsically tied to the surface waters themselves. The state itself is kind of governed by the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, but we are surrounded by other different states. So up here in the Raritan Bay, up the Arthur Kill, and a portion of the Hudson River, that section is covered by the Interstate Environmental Commission. They're headquartered on Staten Island, and they have a report of all of their own. They collect their own data, they do their own assessments. On the west border of the state, that we have the Delaware River down into the estuary and bay. And this section is covered by the Delaware River Basin Commission. They also produce their own data and produce their own reporting. But for today, I'm going to focus mainly on the New Jersey DEP's report. So with all of these waters throughout the state, we have designated them into 3 general categories according to basically how much we care about that water. So at the top of the list are our outstanding natural resource waters. These are the waters that are highlighted in green on the map to the right. You'll see that the waters in the Pinelands region are all pretty much covered, whether they're freshwater or tidal. And we also have some waters up in the northwest part of the state. These waters are like the most pristine that we have. They're going to be like your wild and scenic rivers. And the goal is to maintain these waters in their natural state, to do nothing to these waters that's going to degrade them in any way. Category 1 waters are kind of a small step down from there. They're streams with exceptional significance. And we define this significance in a few different ways. It could be through ecological significance. So a lot of these sections in the pink, especially in the northern part of the state, are going to be our trout production waters. Trout require really cold water streams, really high water quality. And so these waters get some extra protections over our category 2 waters. Category 1 waters also include those with recreational significance. So all of our saline coastal beaches are included in category 1 waters because we love to go to the beach and we love to hop in the water and we don't want to get sick when we do so. We also have waters that are significant for water supply purposes, things like reservoirs. And category 1 waters are protected from any measurable change. Category 2 waters are really everything else. And I put insignificant in italics because I'm kind of being sarcastic. You know, what makes a water insignificant to us that we don't want to protect it to the fullest capacity? These designations are kind of like a push and pull between ecological interests and economic interests. So when we have these wide 300-foot buffers for these really protected streams, I'm saying we can't, but some people say that we can't have those buffers along all of the streams in our state because there's already so much development going on within that zone. So the category 2 waters include all of the other waters of the state. These are the other waters in blue in the map. And for these waters, all designated uses are protected. So anything that DEP says that this water should do, whether it's to support aquatic life or to support trout production, their goal is to make it so. So clean water is a relative term. You know, if someone were to ask you, hey, how's the water quality in New Jersey? That's a tough question to ask. So we kind of break it down into these different sub questions that help us to kind of guide how to answer how our water is doing generally across the state. One question is, can aquatic species survive and thrive? Can I drink the water? Can I go swimming? Or can I eat any biota I catch from the water? And these questions are answered through designated uses. So you'll hear a lot about designated uses today in this presentation and in really any discussion about the integrated report, because all of the data that is collected is assessed according to one of these designated uses. So to assess if aquatic species can survive in a stream, we look at general aquatic life and trout aquatic life. These are separate because, again, trout require some higher standards of water quality. Can you drink the water? That's determined by the water supply designated use. Of course, that does not mean if you go out to a lake or a stream that you should just drink right out of the stream. Absolutely not, and I would never recommend that. But this is saying that after treatment, after like a primary treatment, is the water safe to drink? Next, for swimming, we primarily assess that swimming and boating through the recreational designated use. And finally, we assess whether we can eat fish, clams, or mussels from the water through 2 designated uses. They're separate because we use separate pieces of data to assess the attainment for these uses. We have shellfish harvesting and then fish consumption. So our streams are further classified into these different categories depending on the type of waterway. So this top section, these are our freshwaters, FW. FW1 are non-degradation freshwaters, refers to those outstanding natural resource waters, the ones that we cannot do anything to. And so they're classified a little bit higher, and the water quality standards associated with that classification are a little bit higher as well than the rest of the freshwaters, which are FW2. The FW2 category is divided into how well that water body can support trout population. So if it's sufficient for trout production, then it's probably a little bit colder, the dissolved oxygen is a little bit higher than a stream that's sufficient for just trout maintenance. So if you were to plop trout in that stream, how well would they survive? You don't need as good of water quality as you would need for trout to actually reproduce on their own. And the third category under FW2 is the NT, or non-trout streams, which are not sufficient for trout, and so they're not assessed using those trout-specific standards. Pinelands waters, we saw that those are the outstanding natural resource waters. They have their special protections. We have our saline estuarine waters, which are SE, and saline coastal waters as well. And so I'm just popping this map back up so we can compare the classifications to the designations. Generally, the green sections are going to be your non-degradation freshwaters, your FW1 and your PL. Your category 1 streams are always going to include your saline coastal waters or your ocean beaches. It will also include freshwater streams that are trout production streams, and all saline estuarine waters that are of a sufficient quality to support swimming and shellfish harvesting. These are SE1 categories. For the category 2 waters, that pretty much includes your non-trout water bodies, your SE2 and SE3, saline estuarine waters, but there is some overlap where streams that are sufficient for trout maintenance or non-trout streams can also be categorized as category 1 waters, depending on other opportunities for them to exhibit some sort of significance to DEP. And that could be ecological if they're a home to threatened and endangered species, or recreational or water supply, or any of those other categories. So when we're looking at these streams, we used to, and in other states they still do this, we look at just lengths of stream miles and assess them based on stream miles. We kind of identify these segments, collect data within that segment, and then move on to the next segment to identify what's going on there. In New Jersey, since about the mid-2000s, we've switched over to a model where we're identifying water quality and assessing it based on the HUC 14 subwatershed designation. HUC 14, HUC stands for Hydrologic Unit Code, and 14 stands for the number of digits that come with that hydrologic unit code. So we can have HUC 6s, which are very kind of large basins. HUC 8s are a little bit smaller as we add more digits. HUC 11s are a little bit smaller and we add more digits there, and HUC 14s are kind of the smallest unit that we work in when we're looking at subwatersheds. This map shows the outline of all 958 HUC 14 subwatersheds across the state. When we're placing our monitoring locations, we generally want to place the site at the downstream end or the pour point of the HUC 14. And so the idea there is that placing a site at the downstream end will be able to characterize all of the water upstream. There's some nuance to that, and I'll get into that in a second. But so the stream sites should also be located at least 500 meters downstream of a lake. So we're assessing baseline stream characteristics. rather than any impacts coming from impoundments upstream. They also need to be outside of regulatory mixing zones. So if you've got a big wastewater discharge going into a stream, you don't want to sample there because you're sampling the discharge and not the stream itself. So the idea here is that we're trying to be as representative as possible when placing these locations so that we can have that one data point apply kind of as broadly as possible. We also want to place the sites upstream of a road intersection. A lot of times that's where we're going. We're going to a road intersection. That's where we're able to get into a stream. So placing the site upstream of the intersection allows us to minimize those localized influences that we could see from the road itself. There was an interesting study. I've included a link here if you'd like to click on it to learn more. This was a study done just last year in 2021 that tried to determine from one monitoring point, how far out can you extrapolate that data? That's always been kind of a gap in our information about how well our monitoring networks actually assess the full water body or the full watershed. So this study, they placed a bunch of monitoring sites at differing lengths from each other on a few different water bodies, and they assessed macroinvertebrate communities. They saw that they could see some similarities, a lot of similarities in the macroinvertebrate community, up to 4.5 linear stream miles upstream of a particular point. Of course, that varies depending on the conditions. If you have a more impaired water body, the characterization area is much further than that, actually, because impairments are impairments, and you see an impaired macroinvertebrate community pretty far upstream or downstream. But more pristine water bodies have much more variability between the sites, and that length is shortened for streams that are in really high gradient areas or that are really pristine. So that's just some kind of context to think about how we place our monitoring sites and to think about if we're really performing a comprehensive assessment as is required by the Clean Water Act. New Jersey has adopted a regional rotating basin approach where they will rotate between these 5 different water regions. You see them in the map here. We've got the Upper Delaware and Lower Delaware, which was the focus of the 2018 and 2020 integrated report. The Northeast, the Raritan, and the Atlantic Coastal. So because DEP has a limited staff, they cannot possibly get out to every water body every year to assess conditions, whether it's biological or chemical. And so they've adopted this rotating approach where they will rotate between these basins every year to collect biological data. And so they kind of focus more in on a primary region during this, during a 2-year cycle, not a year cycle. And in that 2-year cycle, they're collecting more data. They're assessing all of the designated uses within that particular water region. But in the non-primary regions, they're still collecting data, but they're not going to assess all of the designated uses. And they'll let past assessments stand in the absence of new data. So if something was had full support or was non-impaired in 2014, then it would continue through to 2016, even if no new data had been collected. So this means that each water region gets a comprehensive assessment every 10 years. They adopted this program in 2014, and so you can see the cycle. We'll get back to Atlantic Coastal in 2024. But for this cycle, we're focusing on the Lower Delaware and the Upper Delaware. The integrated report should be submitted to EPA once every 2 years, but DEP was experiencing a little bit of a lag there. So in an effort to catch up, that's why they've combined these 2 assessments into one and they're calling this recent assessment the 2018-2020 assessment. So they're just trying to catch up, and hopefully we'll get to the Northeast relatively soon because it is 2022 now. So here's a look at the water monitoring network from DEP. This is their ambient surface water quality network. They have 112 sites placed throughout the state, through all of the water regions, and all of these sites are monitored quarterly for your basic chemical and physical parameters, things like dissolved oxygen, pH, nitrate, phosphorus, turbidity. And so they're able to get back to these sites quarterly. But in the rotating basin approach, they'll add 12 additional sites per region, and they monitor these sites more frequently, 10 times per year during the 2-year focus period rather than just quarterly. And again, this cycle is repeated every 10 years. The ambient macroinvertebrate network that NJDEP hosts, also called AMNET, this is the network of biological monitoring sites throughout the state. This includes 760 sites, so it's quite a big jump from the surface water quality network. But each of these sites is only sampled every 5 years. So they rotate around to each of these water regions once a year, and they'll collect data and they will return to each site once every 5 years. This doesn't necessarily fit into the 2-year cycle for integrated reporting, but it is what they're able to do. And so that is where non-agency data really fits in. And it's an effort that we've been working on a lot at the Watershed Institute, is increasing the volume of biological data to fill in those temporal gaps between 5-year periods. DEP has stated that they'll use all existing and readily available data that is representative and of good quality. So what they mean by existing and readily available is that the data must be available on the EPA's Water Quality Exchange, or WQX, platform. It could be, in previous years, it could have been available just on any public data repository, but they've gotten more specific in recent years just to kind of simplify their process of pulling the data. The data should also be representative and of good quality. But how do we establish good quality data for non-agency data? We do this through a 3-tiered system. The first tier includes data that can be assessed for educational purposes. So if you're an environmental commission and you're not interested in going through all the other steps that are required for upper tiers, but you just kind of want to know what's going on in your municipality, that can certainly fit into a tier 1 level assessment. If anyone here is a participant in the road salt impact study that the Watershed Watch Network is hosting, that is another example of a tier 1 study. So we're kind of crowdsourcing data all across the state to make more of a characterization of road salt impacts on water rather than a true comprehensive assessment. Tier 2 is data that can be used for targeting additional monitoring, or it can be used to assess the effectiveness of restoration projects. So you can do pre-project monitoring and post-project monitoring and compare the data between those. But that's pretty project specific, and it does not meet the requirements for representative data. That's really necessary for the integrated report. So tier 3 external data outlines all of the requirements that an external data provider must meet to provide regulatory level data to NJDEP. This requires a quality assurance project plan, certification through NJDEP's Office of Quality Assurance, training and testing for all the volunteers who are collecting data. If you are, I'm going to do a quick plug because, if you are in a group and you're interested in starting your own monitoring program, the New Jersey Watershed Watch Network, that is what we're here for. So you can check out our website here, njwatershedwatch.org. and learn a little bit more about the process. And if you'd like to take the next step, I'd be happy to speak with you and walk you through it. Here's a snapshot of all of the data providers to the integrated report in the 2018-2020 cycle. We've got a mix of all different government levels, from federal, state, county, down to the municipality, academia, and volunteer monitoring groups as well. All of these groups have submitted data. But when looking at the data that's actually used for the report, primarily DEP is relying on their own data and the data collected by EPA or USGS. The utility providers, Brick Township and New Jersey Harbor Dischargers, also make up a pretty substantial contribution to this data. So just returning to this look at the designated uses, let's look at the kinds of data that we actually need to collect to assess these designated uses. For aquatic life, we're primarily looking at dissolved oxygen, phosphorus, temperature, and the biological communities themselves. Temperature is, I would say, more important for the trout designated use because they do require such cold water streams. And temperature really is not so much of an impairment for general aquatic life. For water supply, we're looking at things that we don't want to drink, things like nitrate, arsenic, and chloride. For recreation and for shellfish harvesting, we're looking at bacteria. And so we assess E. coli in freshwaters and Enterococcus in saline or estuarine waters. And for fish consumption, finally, we are basically looking at toxics, things like mercury, dioxin, and PCBs. So we have this data and we have to have a way to compare it. The surface water quality standards are the way that we do that. And I just want to make a note here that I am so guilty of this too. We in this field tend to use the term water quality just universally. And what we mean by that when we say water quality is more like the ideal condition. So what is quality? We have to establish that for ourselves in order to assess the data that we have to figure out if it's meeting what our ideal conditions look like. The criteria, the standards can differ depending on how that stream is classified. So trout production waters require a maximum temperature of 22 degrees Celsius. Trout maintenance waters, it goes up to 25 degrees Celsius. And non-trout waters, 31 degrees Celsius. So you can look at this and say, okay, we're assessing the same parameter in a different way depending on how we perceive this stream to be of value to us, basically. It is my personal opinion, let me just preface that, to say that I think that the temperature standard for non-trout waters is way too high. And that's why we're not seeing so much impairment in temperature for general aquatic life standards. It's because the temperature is really high, 31 degrees. That's like a balmy upper 80s in Fahrenheit. So that's a pretty warm stream. But these criteria, they can exist either in these numerical categories or they can be narrative. Nutrients exist in both of these categories. So we have phosphorus, where we have a numerical criteria, but we also have narrative criteria, which say that the nutrients shouldn't be at such a level that it's impacting the stream, causing algal blooms and eutrophication. The narrative criteria are a little bit harder to assess, right? Because it requires us to look at a stream and say, is this at a level that's bothering me? So it's much harder to assess. The narrative criteria are really, in my opinion, superior to narrative criteria. The criteria do take into account natural conditions. So for example, in the pinelands, where we do have a lot of arsenic, we have variations in how we assess the arsenic data in South Jersey because it's just normal background levels. We also have other values like pH, just normal. It's totally natural for pH to be pretty low comparatively to the rest of the state at 3.5 to 5.5. While other freshwaters, other FW2s throughout the state, that standard is more 6.5 to 8.5. So the criteria will shift depending on how we categorize the water. The criteria also, I wanted to mention this because the criteria do differ between states, and New Jersey is a bit ahead of the curve when it comes to these numerical nutrient standards. New Jersey does have a nitrate standard. It's only applicable to Pinelands waters. That's 2 milligrams per liter. Pennsylvania, New York, and Delaware, no numerical criteria for nutrients. The DRBC these are flipped. Delaware actually has a numerical standard of 0.14 milligrams per liter for nitrate, but it's only for specific waters. And that's the same as it is in New Jersey. But for phosphorus, we have a phosphorus standard that crosses all waters of the state. It's different for streams and lakes. But then in Delaware, they've got this very, very low standard, and it's only applicable to these specific areas. These other states do have narrative criteria, again, just saying that nutrients can't be present at a level in which it creates nuisance conditions, I think it says. But again, that's really difficult to assess. The bacteria standard that we have, it also varies between states. So we're looking, when we assess freshwater bacteria, we look at E. coli, and we need 5 samples over a period of 30 days, of which we take the geometric mean that can't be above 126 colony forming units. Other states have other criteria that are not E. coli. They use fecal coliform, which is a little bit less specific. And also the standard is higher. In Pennsylvania, I find this fascinating. They say, you know what, from October to April, forget about it. Our standard's going up to 2,000. I am so interested in how they got around to making that decision. But New Jersey, among this list, is the only one that actually meets the EPA recommendation for freshwater bacteria standards. So we can pat ourselves on the back a little bit for that. Now we're looking at how the data is assessed. So I mentioned the water quality exchange. That's where the data is uploaded to. That is put into the water quality portal, and NJDEP will pull the data from the water quality portal. They have a specific date that they will do that by. So for the 2018-2020 report, the final date of data collection was June 30th, 2018. And that means that their final data pull from the portal was August 31st, 2018. And just a note for anyone who's collecting data out there, for the 2024 report, the data can be submitted up until August 31st, 2022 of this year for the next integrated report. The method uncertainty. So once they pull the data out of the database, they build in the uncertainty into those values. So if you have a method, let's say, that has an error, or sorry, an error of 0.2 milligrams per liter, and your value is, say, like 0.8 milligrams per liter, you wouldn't be able to really assess a standard of 1 milligrams per liter because you're not really sure if it's above or below that standard with the uncertainty built in. So that does lead into some of the insufficient data that we're finding in the report. Also, I wanted to bring this up because it's just a passion of mine recently. Sensor data is data that is either below a method detection limit or above a method detection limit. So for example, if you're assessing chloride data using our HAWK test strips as part of our road salt impact study, you'll find that if you have a value below a certain level, you cannot possibly determine what the result is because it's just outside of the scope of that test strip. And the same thing, there's an upper value as well. If it's above 650 milligrams per liter chloride, we really don't know the value. So we can just say it's greater than 650 milligrams per liter. So when censored data makes up a lot of the data set, instead they'll use the median value of the non-censored data. So they're not really relying on this data where they're very uncertain about the actual result. But censored data with pathogens is included for statistical analysis at the maximum level. We have minimum requirements for samples before we can assess the data. For most chemical parameters, this means we need to have at least 20 samples over a 2-year period to make an assessment. The standard has to be breached at least twice during that period for that parameter to be considered impaired. And that exceedance has to happen at least a week apart. For bacteria, as I've mentioned, we need 5 samples over a 30-day period, and that data is assessed by geometric mean of those 5 samples. And for biological assessments, we just need 1 during that period. Again, that's only over the past 5 years, so it will not have been within the 2-year period. But we use indices to kind of match the communities that we're finding with the ideal conditions that we're looking for to produce a numerical result. So when we're looking, we collect these macroinvertebrates, we collect these fish, we have to have a way to measure if that population is meeting our standard. We do that through indices. And if you are interested in that, you can visit the njwatershedwatch.org to learn all about biological indices. I feel like that's a whole separate presentation. The data must cover the critical period. So for example, if you're measuring temperature, because the standard is set to be protective of high temperatures, you really should be measuring temperature in the summer. If you're measuring temperature only in the wintertime, that's not really providing us a whole lot of information to make an assessment. And finally, the standards only apply when the stream is at about average flow conditions. This is at a 10-year minimum average flow conditions. But during drought conditions, when there's very little water in the stream, these chemical constituents can tend to concentrate and have extremely high values. So the state has determined that these criteria would not apply under drought conditions. There are 5 sublists in the integrated report. This is how we characterize these assessments. So we've got the data, we've compared it to the standards, we've gone through all these QA measures. They end up on a sublist. Sublist 1 and 2 are the assessment units that are fully supporting designated uses. Now, there's kind of a caveat there because sublist 1, they've combined it here in this table. This is from their most recent report. But sublist 1 used to be a list that only included the streams that had no designated uses that were threatened. Sublist 2 is encompassing of those subwatersheds where no designated uses are threatened except for fish consumption. You'll see here in a minute how the sublist 1 is completely vacant because there are literally 0 subwatersheds in New Jersey that support all designated uses, including fish consumption. Sublist 3 includes the subwatersheds where there's just insufficient data. Sublist 4 are areas where the use is not supported, but there's sort of a reason behind that. It could be that there's a TMDL that has been established and it's maybe working towards an end goal and it's just not there yet. It could be that there's some other measure that's going to occur by the stream, maybe in regards to a point source discharge that's going to improve stream quality over time. Or it could be that the non-support is just something other than a pollutant. Sublist 5, this is what we refer to as the 303D list. So if you remember, the 303D list is the listing of all of the impaired waters in the state. Sublist 5 is that. It does break it up into other categories as well. Arsenic in sublist 5A is very naturally occurring and often naturally occurs above water quality standards. So they kind of separate this out from other water bodies that aren't meeting standards because it is naturally occurring. And there's a lot of conversation happening about, do we really clean up water beyond background levels? Is that feasible for the whole state? And we also have sections that are designated according to pollutants that are legacy pollutants that are no longer being discharged into the stream, but are definitely still making themselves known. So now we'll look at the data itself, what the 2018-2020 integrated report actually says about current conditions of water quality in New Jersey. We'll look at the 6 designated uses one by one, starting with aquatic life use. And we see here that a vast majority of HUC 14s are not supporting aquatic life use in the state. We do have a small percentage that where we have insufficient data. Some of that has to do with the fact that the way that we assess aquatic life use is through macroinvertebrate communities, and we focus this effort in our freshwater non-tidal systems. So where we have insufficient data, there's a lot of overlap with the HUC 14s where they are primarily estuarine or primarily lakes, or where it's a tidal system. So some of that insufficient data can be explained by that. We do have a handful of HUC 14s where we can get some volunteers perhaps in there to help fill that data gap. For aquatic life use for trout, we have a much smaller percentage of the HUC 14s throughout the state that can actually support trout. So you see we only have about 200 of those HUC 14s that are designated for trout use, and about half of those HUC 14s do not support trout. For fish consumption, it's a little bit more dire. All of our HUC 14s throughout the state are designated for fish consumption, but the process of testing for fish consumption use is pretty substantial and pretty time-consuming and costly. So DEP will tend to focus their efforts in a smaller percentage of the statewide HUC 14s. And you can see, of course, that where they have focused their efforts, 99-ish% of those HUC 14s are not supporting fish consumption use. With water supply, we have about a little more than half of our HUC 14s that do not support our uses for water supply. For recreation, primary recreation refers to people getting into the water and swimming, kayaking, where you actually are physically touching the water. We have about half of our HUC 14s that do not support that use, even though they are designated as such. We do have a few rivers throughout the state that are designated for secondary recreation only. Now, secondary recreation refers to boating and other activities in the water where you're on the water and there's a chance that you could fall in, but you're not actively touching the water at all times. So the standards for secondary recreation tend to be a bit higher. And in that small gap up in the top, that's where the few rivers that meet secondary recreation are not actually designated for primary use. And for shellfish, of course, we're only referring to the areas that are kind of coastal, and in those areas, the vast majority are not supporting the designated use for shellfish consumption. We'll start by taking a closer look at the aquatic life use assessment. And for each of these designated uses, we'll look at the geographic distribution of support versus non-support. And then we will look at the trends from 2012 to 2020 to see how everything has changed over the past, 10 years. So with aquatic life use, we see somewhat of a distribution of areas of support in the northwest part of the state and some in the southeast part of the state. So in the southeast, that may have some overlap with the pinelands areas. And in the northwest, we also have heavily forested areas where it's more likely that we have full support for macroinvertebrates. Now, the number one reason for impairment for those HUC-14s that are impaired for aquatic life use is due to the biological communities themselves. So we'll go out and we'll collect macroinvertebrate samples and assess them to determine if they are diverse enough and if they are thriving in this community. If we're finding that they're not, then that is a reason alone to list something as impaired. There are other reasons to list a HUC-14 as impaired for biological use, and that's for things like phosphorus, which is a very common pollutant throughout the state of New Jersey. pH could be outside of the ideal ranges for macroinvertebrates, and dissolved oxygen could be too low to support aquatic life use. So we're also seeing these other kind of chemical parameters that are impacting the biological communities. So with aquatic life use, looking at 2012, 2014, 2016, and 2018, we see a very small increase in the number of HUC-14s that do not support aquatic life use. And we see a small decrease in the number of HUCs where we have insufficient data. So in the pie chart on the right, this kind of shows how each HUC-14 has changed from 2012 to 2020. So we have 58% of these HUCs that have consistently not supported aquatic life use throughout this 8-year period. 12%, on the other hand, are consistently supporting aquatic life use. We have 7% of these HUCs that have improved from non-support to full support, and 5% that have declined into non-support. We have 2% of our HUCs that are kind of flip-flopping back and forth between non-support and full support. And it's in those areas that I feel that we should really focus, because it's much easier to try to prevent a stream system from kind of declining into this impairment, but it's much harder to pull back a stream system that's already impaired. So this area of this 2% that are kind of flip-flopping back and forth, I think we should really focus some efforts for restoration work or green infrastructure in an attempt to mitigate some of the impacts of urbanization. Now, looking at the HUC-14s that support trout use, of course, there's a much smaller percentage of HUC-14s throughout the state that do support trout use. And the majority of these HUC-14s are not supporting trout use because of temperature. So trout need really cold waters. And in these areas in red, we're seeing, in 53% of these areas in red, we're seeing higher temperatures than the trout would prefer or that they can withstand even. We also see in 22% of these HUCs that the fish communities themselves are not meeting our ideal standards. So there is a different way that we measure biological communities in trout use watersheds, and that's by looking at fish communities themselves. And we assess that through what we call the Headwaters IBI, which is an index that looks at fish and metrics of fish community health. So in addition to the communities themselves, we also have some chemical parameters that are outside of our ideal range for fish. So we see phosphorus and pH are outside of that range in 20% of HUC-14s, and low dissolved oxygen in 8%. Since 2012, the number of Huck 14s that are not supporting trout use has kind of stayed the same over the past 8 years. We have seen a reduction, a pretty significant reduction, in the number of Huck 14s that have full support for trout communities. The insufficient data has kind of flip-flopped a bit from year to year. And I think that's because it is more difficult to do a fish assessment than it is to do, say, a macroinvertebrate assessment. So NJDEP monitoring staff are kind of rotating out the areas of the state where they're focusing on fish assessment. So looking at this overall, we have 46% of our Huck 14s that are consistently not supporting trout use, and 10% that are consistently supporting for trout. 6% of these Hucks have improved over time, but 11% have declined since 2012. We still have insufficient data in about a quarter of these Huck 14s over time, and we did get new data in 2% of those Hucks. And again, we see a few of these Huck 14s, 2%, are flip-flopping between improvement and declining, and so we should really focus on our efforts in those flip-flop subwatersheds. For recreational use, most of the Huck 14s that are designated for recreational use are not meeting standards, and that's primarily due to E. coli concentrations, where we have E. coli above our water quality standard. Enterococci is the bacteria, the indicator bacteria that we use in saline or brackish waters, while E. coli is the indicator that we use in fresh waters. So that's why we see that distribution of the reasons for impairment, because most of our state's waters are freshwater. Since 2012, we had a dip there in the middle where we had a reduction in the number of Huck 14s that were non-supporting, but that climbed back up in the most recent assessment in 2018 and 2020. We did see an increase in the number of Huck 14s that are supporting for recreational use, and that's primarily due to a decrease in the number of Huck 14s where we have insufficient data. So overall, we have consistent non-support in 55% of our Huck 14s, and consistent support for recreational use in about a quarter of our Huck 14s. We have improvements in about 6% of our Hucks, and declining conditions in a much smaller number of Hucks. Just 2% have declined since 2012. And we've had new data at 8% of these sites. So where we might have had insufficient data at 8% of these sites in 2012, we've kind of slowly chipped away at that over time to be able to monitor more areas. For the water supply use assessment, the vast majority of Huck 14s that are impaired for water supply are impaired because of arsenic. Arsenic is a super common element in New Jersey and is naturally occurring in our geology, and oftentimes it is above our water quality standards. So we see a pretty kind of general distribution of impairment of water supply across the state. So over time, though, we have seen an increase in the number of Huck 14s that are impaired for water supply from about 290 Hucks all the way up to 450 Hucks in 2018 and 2020. So coupled with that, we've seen a decrease in the number of Hucks that have full support for water supply. So looking at this overall, the changes from 2012 to 2020, we have 36% of our Hucks that are consistently non-supporting throughout this time period, and 29%, which is pretty high, relatively speaking, that are consistently supporting throughout that time period. We see a very small percentage of Hucks that have improved throughout this time period, a very small percent that are flip-flopping back and forth, but we have seen a declining conditions in a good 13% of our Huck 14s. We do still have insufficient data in 17% of the state. For fish consumption, you can see we've got a lot of gray on this map, and these are the areas where we have insufficient data. But where we do have the data, it's a lot of red. So primarily, we see impairment for fish consumption due to toxics in the fish tissue. That could be from mercury, from PCB, from dieldrin, from DDT. Any number of these compounds can build up in the fish tissue, and they're not really dissipating. Even in areas where we're not actively, applying DDT to the landscape, it's a legacy contaminant that is going to remain in the environment for a very long time. And so we'll continue to see these impairments in fish consumption for a while, I would dare say. Looking at fish consumption use over time since 2012, we're not really seeing a whole lot of change. 88% of the Huck 14s that have been assessed for fish consumption have remained consistent in their non-support for fish consumption use. A very small percent have consistent support or have improved over that time, about 1.6% of our Huck 14s. So the insufficient data were assessed at one point, but there's insufficient data to make an assessment of trends over time. So, of course, the actual percent of Huck 14s that have insufficient data throughout the state is much higher. This chart on the right is only referring to those where we do have some data. Now, at the bottom, there's a link to the New Jersey Fish Consumption. This link will tell you exactly which species are safer to eat than others. It'll give you a number of fish that you can eat per week or per month. And the goal here is really to help keep you safe by limiting the accumulation of these toxins in your own body as well. So for more information about water quality in New Jersey, here are some links where you can visit for more information. The EPA How's My Waterway tool is a really great tool for people to use. They've really done some improvements to this over the past few years, and you can click around, click very close to your house, and get some pretty localized information about water quality that is applicable to you. Of course, New Jersey DEP has also produced their own integrated report, which is available through online mapping. So you can click this link to look at all of the Huck 14s throughout the state and each of the designated uses, whether they're impaired or not impaired. And that last link is for the DRBC, the Delaware River Basin Commission, and their assessment of the Delaware River itself. So some final thoughts about the integrated report in general and about water quality in New Jersey. There's not one Huck 14 in the state that actually meets all designated uses. So in this table on the right-hand side, this is a listing of the Huck 14s where we have all of the designated uses met except for fish consumption. So it's pretty rare for non-impairment for fish consumption. But these are the watersheds where we actually meet the other uses. So that leads to another question. Are total maximum daily loads actually working? They're required to be put in place for all of our impaired waterways throughout the state, but for those waters where we actually have TMDLs implemented, are we seeing these improvements in water quality that we're supposed to be seeing? And lastly, I just wanted to refer to this paper because I find it so interesting. The authors here, they did a study where they looked at macroinvertebrate communities across different stream systems, different land use conditions under these various parameters. And they found that the one thing that really defined the macroinvertebrate community in a stream system was the land use conditions 50 years prior. So regardless of improvements that had been made in the last 50 years, regardless of the fact that macroinvertebrates can colonize a stream system very quickly, we're not seeing the diverse communities that were really indicative of non-impaired systems. So it may take a lot of time for our biological communities to revive themselves and return themselves to this pre-urbanization condition. So even if you're installing a green infrastructure project or implementing some other kind of restoration, it may be frustrating that you're not seeing immediate improvements in water quality and immediate improvements in the biological community. And it just may take some time. And so the Clean Water Act was passed 50 years ago. Macroinvertebrate communities are reflecting land use conditions 50 years ago. And I'm hoping that over the next 50 years, we will begin to see improvements in water quality from the policies that we're putting in place today. If you are interested in water quality and interested in learning more, we can continue the conversation with upcoming Technical Friday webinars with the Watershed Institute. On May 6th, we have Helen Pong from the New Jersey DEP Bureau of Environmental Analysis, Restoration and Standards, and she'll be talking about TMDLs 2.0. So this is a great chance to see how we can take the information that we learned today and move forward to actually start making some improvements in water quality. Thank you so much for taking this journey through the 2018-2020 integrated report with me. Here's my contact information if you have any questions.